your children can access higher education, then you're poor. If you can access leadership position in your country because of your gender, then you're poor. If you can't drive around the streets of your country without the fear of being killed, raped, or kidnapped, then you're poor. If you're the only rich individual in your community, then you're poor. If you're living in a continent that houses the highest number of out-of-school children globally, then you're poor. If you're living in a continent that houses the highest number of poor people in the world, then you're poor. Africa is currently identified with all these conditions. This is why we are all poor in Africa. And most importantly, this is why you should care about poverty. According to the World Poverty Clock, as of May 2022, 460 million Africans are currently living in extreme poverty. This accounts for 33% of Africa's estimated 1.4 billion population. Despite the decline in poverty rate in sub-Saharan Africa between 1990 and 2010, from 57% to 48%, the challenges of extreme poverty in Africa persist. According to the World Poverty Clock, with a total population of 83 million people living in extreme poverty in Nigeria, the country currently houses the highest number of poor people globally, closely followed by India. According to the World Bank, Africa's poverty crisis is caused primarily by two factors. The first is Africa's rapid population expansion, and secondly, and most recently, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a cause for serious concern. Now, away from the statistics for a moment. A couple months ago when I started researching for my master's dissertation, I had a discussion with one of the professors in my department who recommended this highly interesting book on poverty by Henny Lotter that would be highly relevant to my research. So I decided to check out the bookstores in Hatfield to see if I can get my hands on the book. Luckily, I found it, but unfortunately, I lost it the very moment I found it when I was told the price by the bookseller. The book was selling for 4,000 rand, and this was a book on poverty. So, the first thing that struck me was, so even books on poverty are not for the poor. Because how many poor people can afford 4,000 rand to purchase a single book on poverty because they want to learn how to get out of poverty? If they can afford 4,000 rand, then they'll no longer be poor in the first place. They could be anything else but poor. Now, what does this tell us about poverty? That poor people cannot afford the means to get out of poverty, from access to employment opportunities, economic empowerment, access to quality education, access to relevant skills necessary for the contemporary workplace tells us something unique about not just poverty, but what it means to be poor in Africa. It tells us that it is expensive to be poor in Africa. There is also the problem of the paucity of research from Africa by Africans on the subject matter of poverty. A problem philosophers like Jonathan Chimamanda have described as worrisome. Now you may ask, what is interesting about understanding poverty in an African context? Over the years, we have been living under the illusion that the success stories of a few individual Africans who transition from poverty into affluence, reflect a collective economic transition of Africans from poverty into wealth. Sadly, that is not entirely true. We cannot use Africa's gross domestic product either to measure our collective economic transition as a people from poverty into affluence, as that has been proven to be problematic by several philosophers and economists like Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, Jonathan Volz, Sabina Al-Kaya, and many others. That a minority of Africans broke the wealth ceiling and transitioned from poverty into affluence does not reflect our collective economic transition from poverty into wealth as a people. Just like a single individual in a family suddenly becoming rich does not make the entire family rich. Therefore, poverty in Africa must be studied and understood from the prism of our collective deprivation as a people. And this must take the form of contextualization. The common mistake policymakers often make in thinking about poverty is thinking that poverty means the same thing for all people, and takes the same form in all communities. This often leads to policy failures. Without the recognition of context and the application of approaches specifically designed for those contexts, any attempt at offering a general solution to the problem of extreme poverty in Africa will always amount to what philosophers like Chimakinama refer to as dispensing novel medicines for certain problems. It doesn't work. A non-contextual approach to fighting extreme poverty risks excluding the most vulnerable segments of the population, but in terms of policy formulation and implementation. This is because it presents a general picture of poverty that ignores the peculiarities of the different societies and contexts in which poverty exists. In other words, it ignores the socio-cultural and socio-economic factors like social and ethnic exclusion, environmental factors like climate change, lack of access to education, political factors like conflict, fragility, and violence, and many other indicators in measuring poverty. Consequently, blanket poverty measures produce blanket outcomes with minimal impact. This often affects the lives of poor people negatively, as policies aimed at tackling poverty problems end up having minimal effects on the specific needs of each communities. Africa is currently the headquarters of global poverty, hence why understanding poverty in an African context matters. Understanding that being poor in Africa encapsulates an entirely different reality from being poor in any other region of the world is the first step towards appreciating the enormity of the task that is before us as Africans in the fight against extreme poverty. For instance, the needs of the poor person in, say, the United States of America, Canada, or the Scandinavian region differs from the needs of the poor person in, say, South Sudan, Chad, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. For example, while the poor person in the United States, Canada, or the Scandinavian region may be deprived of only sustainable basic income, the poor person in the DRC, South Sudan, or Chad is deprived of much more. For example, they are also deprived of good leadership as a result of political corruption and dysfunctional institutions, peace as a result of protracted wars and conflict, lack of access to basic infrastructure for economic mobility as a result of underdevelopment, poor social services as a result of poor funding, social exclusion as a result of certain cultural practices that exclude minority groups, for example, women from positions of power. This is why context matters. Just recently, Quartz Africa released a report that the number of out-of-school children in Africa is nearly 100 million. This statistic is alarming and has grave security implications for the African continent. The current cycle of violent criminal activities like insurgencies, terrorism, and the rest of them cannot be wholly extricated from the challenges of extreme poverty. As some Africans would say, an idle mind is a devil's workshop. So also is a poor hand a ready tool in the factory of violent criminal activities and social destruction. Or as Mayanam people would say, fighting extreme poverty in Africa must begin with the acceptance of the fact that if Africa currently houses the highest number of people in the world, that is, that the majority of Africans are poor, then democratically speaking, we are all poor in Africa. Future poverty policies must prioritize the context of poverty's existence if it is to make significant impact in the lives of the poor. Now, if you're a leader impoverishing your people by stealing the commonwealth of the collective and hoarding it for your unborn generations, you are also poor. You're not exempted. Some people might disagree with this assertion and say, but they can afford luxury cars, expensive mansions, vacations, and all that. What makes them poor? Now, this is how they're poor. What is the value of money? If you can drive around the streets of your country without being surrounded by a dozen men wielding AK-47 rifles, are you at war with yourself? What is the value of money if you're the only rich person in your community and you're surrounded by poverty? Of what value is your money if you're so rich that the only thing that you can afford that is of value is money? No matter the growth in Africa's gross domestic product, no matter the amount of wealth accumulated by a select few, whether legitimately or illegitimately. So long as Africa continues to house the highest number of poor people in the world, so long as Africa continues to house the highest number of out-of-school children globally, so long as the phenomenon of poverty in itself continues to be identified with the African continent, then we are all poor in Africa. This is because poverty anywhere is poverty everywhere. Lastly, I don't think that the green poverty statistic should discourage us all into thinking that there is absolutely nothing that can be done about the situation. On the contrary, collectively, I think that this should inspire each and every one of us to take up the challenge of individual community empowerment, knowing full well that there is enough space for each and every one of us seated here to make an impact. As much as I do believe that we are all poor in Africa, I also do strongly believe that eliminating extreme poverty in Africa is possible. Thank you.